In this video, we'll discuss some principles for constructing a basic melody, especially as outlined in a popular theory textbook called Tonal Harmony by Koska, Payne, and Almain. Now, I should immediately point out that melodic construction is, of course, part of the art of music making, and it certainly can become far more sophisticated than we'll discuss here, but for our purposes, we'll talk about, again, just constructing some very simple basic melodies. Koska, Payne, and Almain outline several areas for melodic construction, including rhythm, harmonic context, contour, and then treatment of things like leaps and tendency tones. We'll keep the rhythmic language we use very simple. Our melodic rhythms are going to occur on the beat and they're going to conclude on a strong beat. Again, more sophisticated rhythms have all kinds of variety, but again, we're just going to keep things simple for our purposes. As our melodies progress, we want to make sure that we're only using pitches that correspond to the chords or the harmonies that appear at the same time. Again, this is another instance where you can find all kinds of creativity in using non-chord tones or non-chordal pitches to help create your melody, and we can talk about that level of sophistication later down the road, but again, for now, we'll only use melodic pitches that correspond to the surrounding harmonies. Contour refers to kind of the overall shape of a melodic line, and we want to create melodic contours that kind of ebb and flow a little bit, but still have what we consider a single focal point, or in other words, kind of a high point of the melody towards everything leading up to it kind of climbs, and then everything after it kind of retreats, so to speak. Now, where the focal point is, sometimes it's kind of in the middle of the melodic activity, sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's a little bit later. There's a little bit of variety there, but we do want to kind of have just one place or one kind of high point in terms of our pitch content. Now that said, on the way towards that focal point and on the way away from that focal point, as the text describes, we want to have primarily stepwise motion. Now we'll talk about leaps, and you can certainly have leaps that do things like outline triads and those kinds of things, but we especially in short melodies, we want to stick to stepwise motion. Now as you do that, as you approach the high point or the peak, and as you retreat from the peak, you don't want it to be so simple as just kind of being scale-like motion, just stepping one step at a time up and then one step at a time away. You do want to have a little bit of change of direction, and this is when I think about contour in terms of kind of like a mountain range. So you may have kind of a main mountain kind of within the range, but on either side of that mountain you do have smaller peaks as well. So there are some changes of direction. There is a little bit of a bit of variety, but still along the way primarily stepwise motion, a couple of leaps scattered here and there, and then having a single focal point for our melody. So when we talk about leaps, of course, that contrasts with stepwise motion that we've discussed. And I should mention that the reason we like a lot of stepwise motion is we want that melody to seem coherent within itself. We want it to be very clear that we're just kind of following one voice along. And if you have too many leaps, well, that kind of gives the impression of multiple voices. Now, with that said, good melodies, as I said before, does include leaps, does include a little bit of leaping. And also, as I said before, sometimes you can have multiple leaps that outline a triad. For our shorter melodies, I wouldn't do that maybe more than just once, because really we're just talking about fewer than a dozen pitches contained within that. So within that very short melody, we want to again have mostly stepwise motion. Now when we do think about leaps, there are certain things we want to be very careful of. One of the things the text talks about is avoiding augmented leaps, and I especially want to draw our attention to this idea of an augmented second. An augmented second is most likely to occur, in fact, when you're writing melodies in minor keys, and that augmented second would occur between a 6th scale degree in a minor key that has not been altered and a 7th scale degree that has been raised. So either moving from that kind of raised 7th degree or that T or that leading tone down to a 6th scale degree, or taking that 6th scale degree or that lowered 6th, that lay, and going up to the leading tone. That actually constitutes an augmented second, which again, it just kind of separates the idea of the melody, makes it sound like a couple of different things are happening. So that's one example of an augmented interval that you want to definitely avoid. Another thing we want to avoid are leaps of a 7th, because again, that 7th is very dissonant and it's kind of hard to reconcile a leap of a 7th with a single voice. Okay. Now, we can have leaps of an octave. In fact, a leap of an octave is considered okay because it's just a way of reiterating a single pitch. But again, because our melodies are so short, I wouldn't have more than maybe just one leap of an octave, if any at all. When you do some of the wider leaps like 5ths or 6th, kind of like we talked about in species counterpoint, you want to kind of surround that leap with kind of fill-in motion, especially fill-in stepwise motion, again to kind of close that sense of an audible gap between the notes. Okay, so when we're thinking about leaps, again, be sparing with them, use them, but be very sparing with them, be very thoughtful about keeping that sense of a coherent voice. different notes within a scale, and therefore that can be used in a melody, can be thought of as tendency tones. And the two that this text focuses on are the seventh and the fourth. Now, when it talks about the seventh, it talks about the seventh and its use as a leading tone. And that doesn't make much of a difference in major because it's going to kind of appear that way anyway in major keys. But in minor, then again, we're really talking about the raised seventh that serves as a leading tone. So the seventh, or the leading tone, tends to want to resolve up to the tonic pitch, or to the first scale degree, in kind of a T-Do motion. And then the fourth scale degree, not always but often, likes to resolve down to a Mi in major keys, or down to a Me in minor keys, or that third scale degree. Now those are kind of generalities, and that's not necessarily always the case. Let's say, for example, you run into a leading tone, but you approach it as part of kind of an overall descending pattern. So maybe you're coming down from the second scale degree, or the Re. You're coming down from the second scale through the second scale degree, through the Do, or the first scale degree, down through that T, and then you may want to keep going down to the La and a little bit further, perhaps. So in a situation like that, the leading tone wouldn't necessarily resolve up, but it often does, especially when you're approaching the end of a melodic line, right? So as you get close to the end of that melodic line, that seventh scale degree really is going to have that tendency to go up, and then near the end also the fourth scale degree is going to tend to want to resolve down to the third scale degree. So just a couple of things to think about with respect to tendency tones. One of the hallmarks of a successful melody is that it's singable. So what we have here is we have the examples presented in the tonal harmony text showing what they refer to as a variety of good melodies and maybe not so good melodies. What I'd like you to do is just take an opportunity to try to sing through these. And hopefully as you're doing that, you can kind of get a sense vocally of what a successful and interesting melody can feel like, even in its simple form.